Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. To start us off with themes and topics for these set of episodes, thought we'd start with Tolkien's view of family and how that relates to his books and how he's written his characters based off of that. For instance, he's made a lot of his stories for his children, and I think that actually influenced his further writing as well. For instance, Beren and Luthien comes from his relationship with his wife Edith, and that's also part two of the uniqueness in the elf-man relationships there. So I guess just to kind of start off with those things with the elf-man relationships and those marriages in the books, why do you guys think that Tolkien, why do you think he emphasized those in such an important way? I guess. Why do you think he made that significant?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's a really tricky one, but I think that you see a lot in Tolkien's work of this deep connection between family members. And yeah, there's just sort of this deep interconnectedness with the families of Lord of the Rings, where almost everyone is sort of related to everyone else who's on the good side, or some descended from someone, who's related. I think this isn't really a mistake that Tolkien sees the family relationships as very important. And yeah, that our families, in some sense, I think in maybe modern society, we define ourselves very individually. Who I am is almost nothing to do with the people around me and stuff. I think Tolkien's work sort of contrasts that with, it defines people very relationally. That Aragorn is the son of Arathorn. He's descended from these people, and he has it's part of his destiny and who he is his relationships to other people, especially his family relationships. So I think that's why as Tolkien sees people as a relational beings and not just as emotional or other sort of beings.
Yeah, I think that a large part of it can come from sort of, he, growing up, he had a very strong family from what I can recall. And especially, I believe, with his mother, he had a very good relationship. And then also with his wife, he had a really strong relationship. And so sort of reflecting that in his work, just that who you are and where you come from is very important and very interconnected, which is why, pretty much every character is part of some bigger lineage, even going as far as, the hobbits are part of these, grand hobbit houses, basically. And a lot of that sort of informs who they are. And I think that's an important aspect for Tolkien.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the hobbits, because that was one I didn't really think about at first, but after you think about it more, not only do you have the really interesting Bilbo is not actually Frodo's father, he's his uncle who adopted him after his parents died, so sort of that this family relationship, even though it's just an uncle, means a lot. And then Frodo's also distantly related to Pippin, and this is sort of one of the reasons why Pippin and Frodo are become very close, though he's obviously close with Merry and Sam as well. But just that these family ties are really, really important in Tolkien's work and do reflect some of his own relationships. I believe he also had a brother he was very close to, so...
Yeah.
His brother died. Or maybe, I got confused there for a second. Never mind.
Yeah. I think he had a best friend who died, one of his friends died in World War II.
I'm getting his story and Lewis's story mixed up in my head, and I can't quite keep straight who had which experience, but I know they both had those sorts of experiences.
I read a biography a couple years ago about Tolkien, and it was very interesting. But yeah, and just sort of his different relationships between his two different extended families is also very interesting. The Tolkien side versus his mother's side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know also that he sort of saw himself and his wife as uh, well, he saw them as reflecting and wrote the story of Beren and Luthien as sort of a reflection of their relationship, in part, and getting back to the sort of elf and human relationships thing, in part because he was Catholic and she was Protestant, and she became a Catholic to marry him, which is in the story is reflected by Luthien changing her fate, by uh, marrying
Mm.
into this house of men, which is not that I think necessarily Tolkien thought that like Protestants weren't a legitimate strain of Christianity or whatever, because he was very good friends with Lewis, but that sort of that's a pretty substantial change to make for somebody to make for love. And so I think that's a big reason why, is because it's not just like those particular relationships are not just, oh, look at this couple and how much they love each other and care for each other. It's like, wow, this person really cares for this other person to the extent that they're willing to give up, their eternality and their immortality to spend what in their experience is a few fleeting years. And I think that he was sort of showing that like it's bittersweet, but it's beautiful and important and wonderful and terrible all wrapped up into one. And I think that's kind of why he was focusing on it, because in the analogy of his world, it sort of hyper focuses and uh, not exaggerates, but it shows more the sort of beauty and sacrifice that love requires and is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't want to get like too sidetracked into Tolkien's life, but the fact that you mentioned his relationship with his wife, but also his mother was Catholic, and the rest of her family was not. And so this was
Okay.
also a deep impression that left it on Tolkien, is that
Mm.
his faith, in opposition to those like who are very close to him as well. Um, yeah, and also it was sort of like a sticking point between him and C.S. Lewis later on, that C.S. Lewis remained Protestant, and Tolkien sort of was always
Yeah.
hoping that he would become Catholic.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Kind of puts makes the whole kind of elf human relationship there unique.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess something else in Tolkien's books, he doesn't make like a completely perfect world. You know, there's still like
No.
broken families and like kind of Turin's experience and you could maybe call like Fëanor's experience too, I guess. Um, but I guess something else that's interesting to think about is just the family trees, just that he's created. Um, because I mean I haven't read a whole ton of fantasy books, but I've read a few of them that were basically copies of you know Lord of the Rings, but didn't even didn't have like the same vast, well, not just languages but vast families either. So there's a lot more detail, at least that Tolkien goes into.
Yeah.
Um, and anyway, so like I guess thinking about just like the nuclear family and how that's you know part of Tolkien's worldview, I guess, in a way. Like I guess that's the way he sees that things should work. For instance, like Elendil's line and whatnot. But you guys have any comments on that?
One thing I would say, and I don't know if this is a statement on his worldview or just sort of an effect of it being a story that needs drama and conflict, but there are a lot of characters that explicitly don't grow up in the nuclear family. So, like, if you think about it, Aragorn, his father is dead and his mother dies very early on, and he's raised by these other people. Frodo and Bilbo are sort of a family unit, but it's an uncle and a nephew. Um, so, like, you definitely have examples of that, but a lot of, like, you have, well, actually, I'm trying to think, because there's a lot of situations where the characters have like a dead parent. Like Denethor and Faramir and Boromir, and I was even going to bring up Elrond, but I think Elrond's wife is dead by the time The Lord of the Rings comes around.
She's
Um,
not dead, but she went to the Undying
she
Lands
went
because
to the
she was
Undying. Yeah,
injured.
that's
So
right.
yeah,
So you have now I think that in a lot of cases Tolkien is not, obviously he's not like saying that those are the ideal situations, and that could almost be a comment on the broken state of the world, is that a lot of these familial relationships are broken. And in fact, one of the several of the places where a nuclear family does show up, it's seen as sort of an example of a place that is working well. So a couple that jump to mind would be um, Thingol and Melian and Luthien being a nuclear family in Doriath before things go poorly, and then Luthien and Beren, and I'm forgetting their kid's name, but after their whole adventure, their sort of reward is that they get to go off and live in this corner of Beleriand that's not really having anything happen. Um, and so those are more the situations. And then also Sam marrying Rosie and having their kids is sort of the reward for after the adventure is done, after things have been set to right. So I think that there is something to that, that it's these people that are coming out of broken situations that most desperately want to have the situation improved.
yeah, and I think what you touch on, like Sam, is really interesting as well. But also, like the end result isn't like, oh, Sam is like a self-actualized person or someone who understands
Yeah,
himself better, but he's someone who's connected himself deeply to the place he lives in and the people around him by having a kid or like marrying and having children and stuff.
yeah.
Sort of is like a very different sort of story than ones we're used to seeing today as well.
It's almost as if Sam's adventure, like part, his ultimate end is that he moves past this great thing that happened to him, this great and terrible and intense thing that happened to him, and he doesn't let it define his life, rather than it being like obviously that's probably the most significant event that ever happens in his life, but he doesn't let it. Not that we get a whole lot of characterization of Sam afterwards, but it's it's he moves on afterwards, and it's sort of like he has the rest of his life. And then, like, if you look in the appendices, Merry and Pippin get positions of authority in the Shire, and then Sam's kids go on and get positions of authority. And so it's like there are things that result from this adventure, but the whole time, the whole reason he's doing the adventure is so that he can move on past it.
I guess one thing that you need to touch on is, this is kind of a difference between the movies and the Lord of the Rings books, but so I've heard like quite a few times actually that one of the biggest beefs people have with the Lord of the Rings movies is the fact that Aragorn is kind of like resenting having to follow this line and become king, like he doesn't want to, right, in the movies. And apparently
Yeah.
in the books, actually, that was not the case. He was very willing to do it, and he was just making his way there, basically. So this is kind of like another interesting. I guess it's like a pretty big part of those books in a way, because Aragorn, eventually becomes king and takes over.
Yeah.
And this is a pretty
Yeah.
big deal, but
I was going to say that, like, so the classic one is that, in the movies, Elrond takes the shards of Narsil to Aragorn in the third movie, and, sort of challenges him and spurs him on towards, like, pursuing his kingly line. In the books, he takes it at the very beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring when he leaves Rivendell. It's already been reforged, so this is, like, from the very beginning, he had planned, I am going to be, like, the next king and save my people and stuff like that, right? So, yeah. Though that isn't my biggest beef with the movies, but we
Yeah,
can talk about that another time, perhaps. But
No,
I
yeah,
think
it's just something that came along with like the whole family line thing. So
I
no,
I
yeah.
think that it's partially just a difference in the characterization of Aragorn in the movies, because like in the books, it's not so much like his arc isn't necessarily about becoming king. Um, I mean, it is, but it's less about him wanting to become king himself and more about people sort of accepting him as king. Because, like, in that climactic moment in the books, when in the movies he brings him the sword, in the books, I don't think Elrond himself comes. I think it's Arwen, and it's some of. Maybe it's not Arwen. No, it's not Arwen. It's
Elrond's
Elrond's
sons.
sons and rangers from the north, and they bring him the banner that Arwen had created for him. And so I will say it's sort of a similar moment, like in the moment itself, where they bring him this symbol of kingship, but it's in the movies, it's like a call to action sort of from Elrond, like, here, I forged your sword, go be the king. And Aragorn's like, fine, I guess I'll go be the king of all men now. And then in the movies, it's like Aragorn has proved himself finally worthy to be the king. Um, and so he's getting the banner, which is sort of his symbol of office rather than like something that he needs to use to prove to other people. Like he's already proven, so he's getting it more as a reward rather than a prod.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing talking about the contrast between the books and the movies. But I think one thing I will also say is that in the books, the hobbits come across as much more the main characters
Yeah,
than they do in the movies, even though they are the main characters in the movies. And Aragorn is slightly less emphasized, perhaps, at least told from his perspective. Whereas I feel
yeah,
like Merry and Pippin are sort of side characters in a lot of the movies in a way, and Aragorn is more the focus on like the other half, aside from Frodo and Sam. Whereas
yeah,
in the books, it seems slightly more flipped, whereas Merry and Pippin are more the focus, and they see things through their own perspective. So Aragorn is sort of less a character that you're meant to relate to as maybe the audience of the book in some
yeah.
ways.
I think that, I mean, you have to remember, sort of getting into a textual analysis side of things, you have to remember that, in a sense, The Lord of the Rings is, not even in a sense, Lord of the Rings was a sequel to The Hobbit. So going into it, the readers were like, oh, I'm reading another story about hobbits. And so, yeah, the hobbits are the ones that go through the character development sort of. It's not really a character driven story so much as it is, like, it is as much as it is like a world driven story. And it's like, it's this greater tale. I think the focus just isn't as much on like, oh, the character's growth over this period of time as much as it is like, this is the telling of an epic tale, and these are our heroes, and this is just what they're gonna do, which I think is fine. I think it's great. I think it's wonderful. It's just not. It would have been written very differently, and the movies are very much a product of their time as much as the books are a product of theirs in terms of themes and storytelling and sort of a reaction against. Actually, the books are a little bit more a reaction against some other stuff, but yeah,
Yeah, this is like I feel like a great place to jump into the Rings of Power because like in terms of like character development being the driving force of the story, it feels like Galadriel's like sort of life learning lessons or like emotional state is like a big driving point in the show.
yeah,
And yeah, that seems to contrast. That like seems to contrast pretty wildly with the way Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings series, at least. Um, but yeah,
it's almost family is almost a bigger theme in the Rings of Power show, just like it is in the movies, because like Galadriel's whole deal is that she's trying to avenge her brother and finish what her brother started. Um, and then you have sort of the family dynamic of the Elendils, the whatever their family is. Um, and then you have Theo and his mom and his elf stepdad, maybe. Um, and then you have the whole family dynamic of the Harfoots. So it's yeah, and I think that's because it's a much more character driven show. Whereas and like in the movies, it's a little bit more character driven. Um, Really, the character that has, I think, the biggest arc in the first book is Boromir, um, because he comes to accept that he was wrong, and it's really only in those last few pages that he kind of comes to realize that. And so I think that, honestly, I think that's part of the reason why I don't think you can adapt nowadays any Lord of the Rings sort of media in a way that people will be happy with on a large scale, because the way we tell stories has shifted over the past 50 or 60 years or however long it's been. Um, and so, yeah, so it's like, it's not, it's not going to be just a grand retelling. It's going to be, if you're making a new story, it's going to be more focused on the characters. So you couldn't do a Silmarillion because it's not really like Tolkien wrote in the tradition of epic tales and sagas. And we don't tell epic tales and sagas. We tell character stories and emotionally driven stories. And those are, you can't really make one of them into the other one. So,
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Though I, for one, would be really happy if they made it. And I think that like it's important to say that, like, just because they've changed over the last 50 years doesn't mean they're better in any way than they
oh
were.
no, I
and
don't
that,
think
like,
so either.
stories,
I would be happy
I think,
for a grand epic tale, but
right.
they're
But
not
the stories, I
profitable.
think, a story is like something immortal, right? That like
Oh, yeah.
stories last forever. And so yeah, it's very different than the way that we tell stories today, and it would be a very risky choice for them to make it. But
Yeah.
I was gonna mention that in the Rings of Power, I think it's really interesting though that we see a lot of interfamily conflict, which is not something you see a lot in the Lord of the Rings books. I mean, we have like this whole the two Durins, the dwarf Durins, going at it as well. You have like a lot of, even Theo and his mother are arguing over some stuff. Just like a lot of interfamily conflict. Elendil and his children as well are sort of
Yeah.
in conflict. That there's always seems there's like tension between the families. Oh, and the Harfoots, of course, where there's like she's hiding the secret from her family. This seems like a way that it really drives tension in the story, as family members conflicting with one another. Which it's like really hard to think of an example of that in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's explicitly like shown really, but there could be some of that like taken from the Silmarillion in certain points.
The the biggest
Even, but yeah,
well, I was gonna say the biggest intra-family conflict in the Silmarillion would be what's his name? The guy who he's like the son of the dark elf that goes to Gondolin. Maeglin?
Maeglin, yeah, that's right.
Maeglin, yeah, he kind of doesn't get along with his family at all.
I mean, I was gonna say Feanor, but yeah.
Oh
that
yeah,
works
and
too.
Feanor. Never mind. I don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah, that'd be the biggest interfamily conflict.
man.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
picks a few fights here and there.
Yeah, he's a little bit of a troublemaker. Just a little bit.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've talked about this before on our show that like I think that the Rings of Power really struggled by not having like a clear and persistent villain throughout the whole show, where it seemed
Yeah.
like, oh, Sauron's like somewhere out there, but like what is he doing? And like we have the Adar who's like here, but he's only like in one of the storylines, and like seems like he's not. And I think this is like really interesting that like because they didn't have it, like in the Lord of the Rings, we don't need interfamily conflict, right? Like if anything, we need like our family bonds to strengthen us so that we can fight against the evil Sauron because he's like overwhelmingly powerful. Whereas in this story, because there's not that, to keep some conflict in the show, we need to like keep raising these family issues and struggles,
Yeah.
which is like a different choice that they've made.
I mean, it turns out we do know what Sauron's doing the whole season.
It's true,
But he's just not being a villain for most of it.
right?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how they play out Galadriel's family. Because I feel,
Yeah.
because that's the one thing, like the only real, okay, besides Elendil's like children and all, but I feel like that's like, despite like the little like differences they have, I mean, I think it's a pretty accurate. I mean, and the daughter, being there that
Yeah.
shouldn't be there, but
She's gonna die.
I think with that, I think they do pretty well with their family and all. I don't even know if they're supposed to have if their mother is around at all.
Tolkien Tolkien
But
doesn't mention a lot of mothers.
yeah.
Now that I'm thinking about it, most of the dead parents are mothers.
But yeah, so anyways, it'll be
To be fair, Aragorn's
interesting.
dad dies instead of his mom. His
That's
mom does
true.
raise him.
But and
But
then
then
she
she
drops
dies.
him off with the elves, and then
Yes.
she dies.
She stays with him, I think, for a few years at Rivendell, though not long.
Yeah, because she calls him, but I don't think he
Estelle.
remembers her because she calls him Estelle or Estel or however you pronounce it in Elvish, and then it's only later that Elrond's like, by the way, you're the heir of like all the kings of men.
Yeah.
Go conquer or return to Gondor or something.
Yep.
Yeah. But I was gonna say, I think it's really interesting that Galadriel's family is like sort of important. Like Arwen is also her, granddaughter and stuff, so she plays a huge role. Like the whole family in itself, and it's like the fact that this show is sort of just cut out seemingly entirely almost, and there's this like one, a few lines about Celeborn, but also the way they portray Celeborn, whereas in the books he's known as this really wise, really strong warrior as well. And like whereas like it's sort of almost a co-leader, though Galadriel probably would be considered the leader, is like very much a strong right hand at least, whereas Galadriel's lines about him in the show are like, oh, I saw him like putting on armor and he didn't even know what he was doing, like he's some sort of innocent guy who's like, she's like protecting or whatever. Seems a pretty different portrayal than the way he's portrayed in the book, but maybe we'll see something different in the future of the show.
It'll be interesting to see, because I could definitely see with their portrayal of Galadriel that that's sort of her perspective, where it's like, no, he actually is a good warrior and knows what he's doing. She's just kind of hot-headed, which again, like in my mind at least, the hot-headedness fits a little bit with how she is for a long time. But like, yeah, because we know like he's at least cool enough to have a named spear, which might be almost unique in the Lord of the Rings. That most legendary warriors are like swords and stuff.
What's the name of his spear?
Aglost. It's something.
Gil-galad's spear, not.
Oh, I'm thinking of Gil-galad.
Sorry, I love my Lord of the Rings weapons, and I was like, wait, what? Yeah, I've never heard of this.
I'm getting elves confused. Never mind.
But what's interesting is like, it's really interesting because Celeborn is actually older than Galadriel is, I think. I believe he stayed in Middle Earth whenever the rest of the elves went to Valley Nor, and so he's actually like super duper old.
That's true.
But also like someone who's wise, someone who's seen a lot of history, seen a lot of Middle Earth. So he is like also Galadriel has like a lot of magic power, wisdom, and stuff like that too. Yeah. Like I said, they're very much like a team and a very strong team. So if he does appear in the show, I will sort of be hoping for that and not like having him be a secondary character or someone who's just there to make Galadriel look good. Sort of
are we talking about Celebrimbor?
Celeborn.
Okay, I was going to say Celebrimbor is definitely younger than Galadriel because he's like Feanor's grandson.
Yeah, he's younger.
Gosh darn it, Tolkien, all your elves sound the same to me.
I know,
sick.
right? So this
That's
is really
my
interesting.
excuse. I'm sick.
So Tolkien played with this. I don't think it's actually canon, but that like Tolkien played this idea of having Celebrimbor be another love interest for Galadriel, and that Galadriel eventually chose Celeborn at some point.
That does
which
sound
is really interesting.
Familiar.
But
interesting.
That does sort of maybe lead us to suspect that Galadriel and Celeborn have not been married that long, in terms of like elvish timelines.
Yeah.
But because Celebrimbor is a lot younger, if Galadriel only chose Celeborn later, then maybe at this time there's still time ahead for her to get married, have a kid. So blah blah.
I wonder if they'll show Thranduil at all, because
Legolas's father.
Yeah, I think he's around at this point, right?
So I know Legolas's grandfather fights in the last alliance of elves and men and dies there.
I know he's the king of the Wood Elves at that point.
Yeah, so I think he may we might see his grandfather. I forget the grandfather's name,
It
but
starts with an
like
O.
maybe the father will make a cameo or
Yeah.
something.
Because like at this point, what is eventually Doggle Door is their capital. Um, that'd be kind of cool to see.
Yeah,
That's a family.
it is. Yeah. Well, I feel like we haven't talked about the Harfoot family at all, too, and that one was like one they spent a lot of time with. But
Oh yeah. Well, I like how there's I like how they kind of portray them, and I think they're sort of standing in for the like salt of the earth kind of people, obviously because they're hobbits, but definitely standing in for the like generally good-hearted but very suspicious of all the weird stuff that's going on around them people. Like I think in our main podcast when we were watching the episodes, we talked about how they like they're they act all like forgiving and stuff, and then like they're totally savage to this family. Like, yeah, no, if they fall behind, just leave them to die. Like, um,
Leave no one behind.
yeah, leave no one behind except for these losers.
let's take their wheels, right? And
Yeah,
leave them to die.
their wheels. Um, which I think I kind of like that they're portraying them as like, because like to be honest, that does feel very hobbitish, where it's like, yeah, they're all warm and welcoming, but also like they're kind of stubborn and kind of a little bit mischievous. Like when you get to like depending on the strength of character of the different hobbits, you know, you have the Saxville Baggins who are like just freaking ruthless. And then you have Farmer Cotton who just stands up to and is rude basically to a bunch of Nazgul. Like, it kind of gets across that sort of uh, generally good-natured but a little bull-headed nature of the hobbits, which I personally enjoyed, and I think it kind of reflected a sort of what some kinds of insular families can be like, where they're like they look out for their own, but as soon as somebody starts acting weird, they kind of marginalize them and push them to the edge of the group. And I just thought it was a very honest depiction of that, where at the end of the day, they do really care about the members of their family and the members of their group. It just can sometimes take a little bit for them to see that.
Yeah, I honestly like really enjoyed the overall depiction of the Harfoots, and like I think a lot of the points you made are really great. That it's like a very honest depiction. I just to play devil's advocate, I will say in Tolkien's work, there's one thing hobbits are like never really portrayed as, and that's like malicious. Like, and
Yeah.
taking the wheels off somebody's carts is pretty malicious, right?
Yeah, well, see, they
um,
suggest it, but they never do it.
that's fair, but it's just a little dark.
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't know. So
I kinda-
I guess like most of the other stuff I was like really on board with, like, oh, like, you know, it's like this is also a harder time for them, you know, they're not in the Shire, they're wandering, so like, yeah, people are gonna die and they're gonna have to leave people behind and make hard choices. And how they sort of like still try to keep a community together throughout their like travelings and wanderings was really cool.
Yeah.
Just maybe it was like, oh, that's like a little bit far on this like Hobbit murder track
Yeah.
or something. I don't
To
know.
be fair, this is the same era of hobbits that eventually produces Smeagol, who it's like, yeah, he was affected by the ring, but like he doesn't seem to have been like if he was
He
willing to
murders him
murder
to get the ring.
yeah, if he was willing to murder Deagle to get the ring after like seeing the ring for like 5 seconds, like there was something there before.
Yeah, point taken. That's actually a great shout out. Though I will say it's actually a long time later if this
Yeah.
is really the second age.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great point. There is some malicious hobbits out there. So
This is the like because I always sort of pictured because you have the Shire hobbits who are all like friendly, nice folk, and like I always kind of pictured this could be my interpretation entirely, but I've always pictured like the Bree hobbit to be a little bit shiftier and a little bit shadier, and then the hobbits that are just out in the past, just nomadic. I always kind of, in my mind, it makes sense that they'd be a little bit more cutthroat just because they have to be that way to survive in the wilds. So yeah, and I think that it's the right level of cutthroat for a hobbit to be like, yeah, let's cut their wheels and then not actually do it.
Fair enough.
It's also kind of reverse comic relief, where it's like the joke is that can you imagine hobbits being this ruthless to their family?
Yeah, yeah.
So I
I
think
feel like we've.
that
Oh yeah. Go
I was just gonna say, yeah. So I think, probably Galadriel's family could have the biggest change, I guess, in the show than the other families that are being betrayed. Even despite like we were saying that even the focus on the family's not getting along entirely. But yeah, so we guess we'll see how that pans out. Hopefully, Celeborn still has a good light shown on him. Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. Consider supporting my movement on Facebook, Keeping the Rings of Power Pure.